in the previous part of this bill around the fines that can be and the penalties which can be made.
I call the Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Chairman, the history to this part of the bill is illustrative of the poor process that the government's been running here. The Select Committee was considering the legislation. Various parties, including the Labour Party, were concerned at the suggestion that the Commerce Commission would have no jurisdiction following the passage of Part 2 of this bill, which inserts a new Part 4A into the primary legislation. And there was considerable pressure brought to bear through the media, who said that it was quite unwise of the Minister to contemplate an absence of regulatory oversight of this new area of undertaking. And the Labour Party wrote to the Minister and said, look, we need to talk about this, and we wrote a very reasonable letter, I thought, expressing our concern and asking for a response from the Minister, which we never got. And then we wrote again saying it's time that we got a response. It was by then too late by the design of the Minister to make amendments at Select Committee, and so the bill was reported back with these inappropriate provisions in the bill that said that there should be no regulatory oversight because the Commerce Commission was precluded from doing things that it could otherwise do. So, Mr. Speaker, we then had the Minister say publicly that he was going to back away from those provisions. I suspect partly because there was a doubt as to whether he could pass them in this House, because there were concerns being expressed not just by Labour and the Greens but also by the ACT Party and by the Maori Party as to whether what was being proposed by the Minister was wise. So we then thought, well, we're going to get to a reasonable place here. We're going to get to a reasonable place where we have some regulatory oversight post these new arrangements. Now, I have no problem with long-term contracts being entered into with Telecom. What I do have a problem with is effectively the ouster of any jurisdiction that could look at whether what will be then the dominant player is abusing its position in the way that is not in the interests of competitors or consumers. So, Mr. Chairman, I was then surprised to hear that the amendments that we would have when we saw them from the Minister, set out in the Minister's supplementary order paper, remove some of those offensive provisions relating to the ouster of the jurisdiction of the Commerce Commission. But then we're told, and we've yet to see, that similar effect provisions are being inserted into the contracts themselves. And I asked the Minister to take a call as to whether the indemnity that is proposed to be given, as we've seen in news reports, whether there is an indemnity proposed to be given in the contracts with Telecom that indemnifies Telecom for all losses that might be occasioned to them as a consequence of future regulatory action. Now, these things may have been misreported in the newspapers, but I'm not in a position to judge whether that's the case. I haven't seen those contracts. But if there is that undertaking that the Crown will indemnify Telecom in respect of all of those risks, I ask the Minister how he justifies that. If he can't convince this House to pass legislation to oust the jurisdiction of the Commerce Commission, and there is being some jurisdiction left with the Commerce Commission, how can he think it's right that he, in the contract, effectively overrides what would be the statutory provisions by providing for a contractual term to the same effect? And if that is the effect of what is being proposed, I expect some of the competitors of Telecom are actually considering whether the Minister's got the power to do that, because it would be very surprising to me that the Parliament wouldn't agree to effectively oust the jurisdiction of the Commerce Commission, but the Minister could have such broad powers as to do just that by contract. And even if that wasn't right as a matter of law, how can that be right as a matter of principle? That the Minister could by contract give an indemnity in respect of those matters. Now, Mr. Chairman, there has been some misrepresentation of the Labor Party position on this. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it has been suggested that the Labor Party would break contracts. We haven't said that. What we have said is that we would review the regulatory regime to make it clear that the regulator has the right to assess according to sound and standard regulatory practice as to whether these contracts or whether the conduct of Telecom and indeed whether the conduct of the Minister, given that the Minister's saying that he's going to try and take these contracts beyond the law, whether the conduct of Telecom breaches fair regulatory standards, and if it did, well, the consequences would flow according to that legislation. That's not the same thing as the Labor Party saying that it would break the contract. We're not saying that. We're saying that the regulator should have the power to regulate monopoly access. Now, if there is no monopoly access in the future, no one has anything to fear. And I again stress that this is not to say that long-term contracts are inappropriate. Long-term contracts are necessary in order to give contractual certainty to the parties in respect of these important capital investments that they're making. And indeed, the long-term interests of consumers already pay regard to the fact that you can have long-term contracts which are in the long-term interests of consumers. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm wanting to hear from the Minister why it is that he doesn't think that it's appropriate now to have legislation which outs the jurisdiction of the Commerce Commission to give a remedy to consumers who might be abused by uncompetitive monopoly practice, but how, and if he is of that view, and presumably that's why he's removed these provisions from the bill, if he's of that view, how can it be appropriate for him to do the same thing in effect by contract?
Chairman. The Honourable